Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual press event following Chair Powell's final speech of the year. My name is Jay Aaron, and I'm the Communications Director at Groundwork Collaborative, an economic think tank based in Washington, D.C. A few hours ago, the Federal Reserve announced that interest rates will remain unchanged for the third strategy policy meeting and signaled that there will be 75 basis points of cuts in 2024. I'm joined by three economic experts. Please introduce yourselves, but I'd love to, when you speak, but I'd love to just first start with immediate reactions to the FOMC's statement and Chair Powell's speech today. Let's start with Skanda, and then we'll go to Kitty and then Jen.
My name is Skanda Amarnath. I'm the Executive Director of Employ America. We're a macroeconomic policy think tank focused on full employment. My immediate reaction is that this is a step in the right direction and a step away from the dangerous dogmas that were ruling Fed policy through their campaign to raise interest rates. That campaign was premised on the notion that there must be pain, there must be a cost that workers must inflict in order, must bear the burden of in order to bring down inflation. What we've learned in the last 12 months is quite the opposite, that actually there's much more that was driving inflation that had nothing to do with the labor market. And we're seeing a lot of progress right now on inflation. If that progress continues, I think the Fed has signaled quite softly, but at least they are signaling that if the labor market looks normal and inflation looks normal, interest rates should look normal. And what we have right now are what the Fed even admits are significantly restrictive levels of interest rates. Normalizing away from those restrictive levels will be important, both because of the costs in terms of the risks to jobs, risks to investment, but also what that means for the supply side of the economy in terms of how it helps to enhance productivity. If we're curtailing investment, that also affects all sorts of challenges that we face in the coming months, quarters, and years ahead. So the Fed has a lot at stake in terms of getting this right. They're moving in the right direction. It's about moving there with expeditious speed and prudence. So long may it continue.
Thanks, Skanda. Kitty?
Hi, I'm Kitty Richards. I am a senior strategic advisor to Groundwork Collaborative, but also a former Treasury Department official. I want to echo a bit of what Skanda said, but what really stuck out to me about Chair Powell's comments today is that Chair Powell himself described the data very clearly. A year ago, nearly every economist was forecasting a Fed-caused recession along with falling inflation. Instead, we've seen rapid disinflation driven by supply increases while demand and growth stayed strong. I find it incredibly puzzling then that Chair Powell continues to say over and over that the key question is, has the Fed done enough? Instead of, did we need to do this at all? The Fed really needs to reassess their theories and what they mean for the correct policy and focus much more on the real harms that high rates are causing right now and the significant downside risk of overshooting, throttling a thriving labor market, and disturbing the supply chain corrections that have already brought inflation down so rapidly.
Thanks, Kitty. And last but not least, Jen.
Sure, thank you. Hi, Jennifer Harris. I'm the kind of founding and interim director of BuildUS, a pooled philanthropic fund focused on implementing historic federal investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And like Kitty, a former Biden administration official, having served the first couple of years of this term in the White House, covering international economics. I think what I'd like to add to Skanda and Kitty's laydown is one more dimension of the stakes behind getting the Fed to cut sooner than not, which are precisely these historic investments that, not for nothing, seem to be doing some of the work in bringing down inflation in the, over the stretch that we've seen thus far. I don't want to make too much of these green shoots and the role that some of these investments have played thus far in bringing down inflation, but I do think that you see early evidence of their kind of beneficial role in this cooling, and certainly things like the shift that you've seen in employment to higher productivity sectors, exactly the kind of sectors that match up to some of the early moving pieces of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA. And likewise in some of the labor market shifts around some of the ways that we plan to push supply productivity to the right in this country, things like energy jobs in transmission spiking up lately, alongside the kind of the well-known story around spending in construction and fixed investment going up. This is really, I think, evidence of a new economic model at work that is really leading with a set of supply side investments and fixes to what has been from the start a supply side created bout of inflation. We had this big test, question and debate whether inflation was really the product of the supply chain kinks coming out of the pandemic, with too much demand chasing too little supply as we got back on our feet, or whether we were looking at something deeper seated, more akin to 1970s. I think we have now our definitive verdict after 2 successive months of inflation essentially flat. And as Kitty and Skanda have mentioned, the question is when the Fed was going to take yes for an answer. And while the rest of the economy may be able to kind of muddle through with a kind of higher for longer interest rate environment, these fragile, capital intensive investments in our clean energy backbone and our productive capacity in infrastructure cannot, right? These are very capital intensive, where you see the pains of a high interest rate environment falling much more acutely than your kind of general pains of what it looks like to run, say, a gas utility in these high interest rate environments. So I think you just looking at one sector, offshore wind, it's seen estimates suggesting that 60% of the cost increases in offshore wind are squarely to blame on the high interest rates. And I think I'll just end with the kind of natural experiment that the world has at its disposal in the high inflation that you've seen really grip all G7, OECD countries. And when you think about how sharply US inflation has come down relative to the persistent inflation we see in those other countries, and ask what is different, it is clear that these fiscal investments stand out as propping up consumer expectations, productivity gains. I think a lot of the happy story that we have to tell in the labor market. But they're not bulletproof. And I think we need to kind of bubble wrap them and hopefully they will continue to do increasing work over the medium term around bringing down inflation, squeezing down that last mile that Chair Powell spoke about, and live up to its namesake. The Inflation Reduction Act wasn't so billed for nothing. These are a set of supply side investments that will push our productive muscle capacity to rightward, and I think have a persistent disinflationary impact for some time to come. That alone should be grounds for the Fed getting more creative, and frankly the executive branch more creative on protecting these high capital intensive investments, cabining them from the rest of the economy, which may well be able to muddle through. I don't think you need to reach for a set of climate justifications to want to do more to provide some tailwind to and defensive help to these fragile capital intensive investments. I think you have all the rationale one needs in their disinflationary impacts over the medium term. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you. Skanda, did you have something to add?
Oh no,
So I'd love to thank you so much for those immediate reactions. Skanda, I'd love to turn to you. Last week, Employ America put out a paper which argued that the Federal Reserve should front load rate cuts, starting with a 50 basis point cut. Today, the FOMC signaled they're most likely 3 rate cuts totaling 75 basis points coming in 2024. Can you talk a little through the consequences of waiting too long to cut or cutting too little?
Thanks. I would first like to reiterate the Fed should be taking a data-dependent view of how it should be setting interest rates, but we are playing with fire here, right? We are playing with fire in the sense that interest rates have been raised very quickly to very high levels relative to recent history. These were not interest rates that were anticipated by the private sector, by business actors, by households, families for the past, especially if you look over the last 3, 4, 5 years, they were not expecting a 5.5% interest rate to deal with in terms of what the Fed sets. And in that environment, you typically have 2 things to fear. We saw one version of it earlier this year in terms of financial stability. The Silicon Valley bank crisis and the contagion to regional banks was born of a kind of interest rate risk. And it just shows how these things materialize in unforeseen places the longer we stay at these restrictive levels. The Fed's justification for effectively playing with fire was that inflation was high, so we have to take some extra risk with financial stability, with risks to the labor market. Turns out you don't have to take those risks now, at least. That should be pretty clear. And that's a reason to move a little bit faster away from 5, a little bit faster away from 4.5% interest rates even. So that does call for some being extra swift at the front end. Let's see how the data plays out completely, but I think the motivation is quickly accumulating to be able to make a move quickly. The second part of it, though, I've talked about the labor market, I've talked about financial stability, but the other part I would raise is about productive capacity. A lot of the points that Jen's making are actually worth really appreciating. We've not really seen the Fed have much effect on consumption. We have seen the Fed have material effects on investment. Some of these are obviously very closely tied to the energy industry. You can see it in wind, you can see it in solar, you can also see it in nuclear, you can also see it in hydrogen. But you also see this materialize in housing. We also see this materialize in research and development. These are places where supply is critical, both for managing price stability risks and for where maximum employment can be over time. These are both key parts of the Fed's mandate. The Fed does have an impact on the supply side over time. There's pretty good research now that says the Fed, when they actually raise interest rates, if they inflict credit crunches, those also affect the supply side for key industries in construction and manufacturing. So it's really important that we don't do excess harm. And I think actually the case for taking a data-dependent view of how far the Fed needs to go in terms of normalizing interest rates is ultimately something where they're going to have to monitor the supply side of the economy more closely. There seems to be a stronger appetite for investment right now, especially given all the legislation that's been enacted. And it would be especially critical for them to think about how their interest rate policies, which they think of as only being demand-side policies, actually do interact with the supply side. We may find, as interest rates may have a chance to normalize next year, that there is more productive capacity that's unlocked. It would be a shame to forego that if the Fed decided to be stubborn about normalizing interest rates over the course of this year and next.
Kitty, building on Skanda's response here, Chair Powell addressed a question today about the risks of waiting too long to cut rates. How should we think about the very real impact of the Fed's rate hiking campaign and the potential harms of waiting too long to cut on families and households? What are some of the direct harms, and what does this mean, surrounding broader concerns around affordability of housing, groceries, and other essentials to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we talk about inflation, we can tend to get very abstract and macroeconomic in the way that we talk, which makes a lot of sense. But I think it's actually really helpful to look below the top lines and think about, why do we care about price stability and inflation? People care about not inflation, but whether they can afford the things that they need for a thriving, secure, middle-class lifestyle. And so the price increases that people are really focused on are the ones that make it harder for them to make rent, to make their mortgage payments, to put gas in the car, to put food on the table. And there's a lot of focus when we talk about Fed policy and interest rate policy on the theoretical effects on households via the labor market. But we don't focus nearly enough on the ways that high interest rates themselves materially harm households as they are trying to make ends meet. So housing is actually a really good example where it is true that house price inflation, as in the change in the sale price of a new home month over month or year over year, has moderated over the last year. And in fact, in some places, the price of a new home has fallen somewhat. However, the actual cost of a new home, because the vast majority of people who purchase a home do it with a mortgage, not with cash, has gone up dramatically because mortgage rates have gone up so dramatically. And so for an actual household, while we see housing price inflation going down, actual households are seeing the cost to buy a home go way up. And that doesn't just affect new home buyers or people who, for various reasons, need to refinance their mortgage and are now looking around and seeing that they would have to give up a 2.6% rate in favor of a 7.5% rate. It takes thousands of dollars a year out of the pockets of all of those folks who are purchasing those new homes or facing those higher mortgage rates. But it also puts home purchase out of range for a whole host of people who would otherwise be trying to buy, which leaves them in the rental market longer than they would be. Those folks then drive up rents for everyone else. So even in the short term, we are seeing the ways in which the affordability of housing is being directly made worse by high interest rates. And then, as Skanda alluded to, in the medium to long term, housing has been at a crisis level of supply shortage and unaffordability for many years now. And we are building on that because while the Fed has not made housing directly more affordable, what they have done extremely effectively is slow the construction of new housing. And that is something that is already going to be driving up housing prices as soon as next year. It's that supply side piece that poses the long-term risks that Skanda has been talking about, but we also shouldn't ignore that the Fed is directly making housing less affordable right now for families across the country. And I focus on housing both because it's a huge part of the family budget and it's a real illustration of the harms of interest rates because it's such an interest rate dependent area of consumption. But it's also a huge part of the basket of goods that makes up the consumer price index. And so when we're looking at inflation and we're looking at shelter costs growing, we need to be thinking, what does this actually mean for affordability? Is the Fed actually having a positive effect on this trajectory or making it worse? And that same dynamic plays out as you look at other categories. The other thing that I would say is we really need to think about how we are affecting family balance sheets in the short term and the long term. There was really fantastic news in this year's release of the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances that wealth has actually gone up for the typical family, and especially for the typical Black family in this country over the course of the pandemic recovery. That is the opposite of what we saw during the Great Recession and the recovery from the Great Recession, where wealth was just stripped out of communities across the country. However, high interest rates cause damage to family balance sheets. They cause increased debt accumulation that has the ability to strip away a lot of those wealth gains. And the longer high interest rates persist, the more that compounds on itself. And the way to think about it, it's really pretty simple. When you have to borrow, which every middle-class family has to borrow. They have to borrow to buy a house. They have to borrow to pay for education. They have to borrow to buy a car to take themselves to their job and their children to school. All of those things are just vastly more expensive when you're in a high interest rate environment. And in a low interest rate environment, you're able to very quickly pay off your debt. Whereas if you raise interest rates, now suddenly you can barely afford to make the minimum payment, and debt accumulates and accumulates and accumulates. And we've seen this over the sweep of history and the growing indebtedness of American households since the 1980s, that it's really a high interest rate phenomenon. And it would be a real tragedy if we reverse the progress that we've made on wealth accumulation for the typical household, purely through the mechanical effects of high interest rates.
Thanks, Kitty. And I just want to put a reminder to please put your questions in the chat and we'll answer them. We'll pass it on to our panelists. Jennifer, you touched on this in your opening remarks, but some other folks have joined since. There's been a lot of talk, and you've talked about how the Fed's rate hike campaign could hinder our fight against climate change and the effectiveness of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you talk a little bit about how waiting too long to cut could jeopardize our path to decarbonization and really our clean energy future?
Sure. Yeah. So just a kind of a brief retread for those who have joined in progress. I think the basic story here is that in a higher for longer reality that the Fed seems mostly inclined to keep us in, the mainstay of the economy may be able to kind of muddle through, although with, as Kitty and Skanda have ably pointed out, subpar results. The piece that becomes really worrisome are the very capital intensive investments that we just passed historic legislation to stand up in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the Chips and Science Act. And it's not clear that these projects, both those have been announced in, frankly, a very different interest rate environment. Interest rates have doubled since the IRA was passed. It's not clear that these investments can ride out the next 18 months of rates at historic highs, precisely because of how much upfront financing is involved with all of these, especially clean energy projects. And why is that a shame? I mean, there's a kind of sad irony at work here, which is that these very investments seem to be firing upon the early stages of themselves actively contributing to our disinflation. They are solving our inflation problem for us. I don't want to overmake this case, and I think this case will strengthen as we get out over the next year or two with these investments. But they are essentially pushing our productive muscle, our supply, in a lot of backbone areas to the right. If you think of inflation boiled down as too much demand chasing too little supply, you solve that by a set of supply side investments that look a whole lot like the ones involved in the IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so a major risk, at least, if not the main risk, of the Fed not getting more aggressive and cutting sooner is that the Fed could be, frankly, biting the hand that is trying to feed it disinflation over the medium term. Probably we don't have to explain to this audience, how inflationary, a fossil fuel dependence has been over our country's history, including the last couple of years, and at the rates of clean energy adoption and deployment that we're seeing, which frankly exceed even the wildest expectations of a lot of the architects of both of the relevant bills I mentioned. We could certainly be upon a permanent fix for that kind of fossil fuel driven inflation, really, in the next three years, as long as we don't, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory here with the Fed keeping rates unnecessarily high.
Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate that. And again, please put your questions in the chat. This question, Kitty, this question might be best for you, but please, anyone answer it. Chair Powell said that wage growth, he said during his conference today that, wage growth above 4% is inconsistent with a 2% inflation target. Kitty, is this true based on what we know about what is driving inflation?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's something I really want to answer. It honestly, I find it extremely frustrating when folks toss around this idea of what is and is not consistent with inflation when it comes to wage growth. The way that Chairman Powell is talking about this is based on just a very simple equation that the cost of making goods plus profit equals the price of goods. And one of the costs of making goods is wages. And when they are thinking about what level of wage growth is consistent with stable prices and with stable prices and reasonable levels of growth, the way that they think about it is we have a guess about what productivity growth is, and we think it's going to be 1.5% every year over time on average. And so what is consistent with 2% inflation? You can only have, a little bit of real wage growth that's equal to that productivity growth. The piece that's missing is the piece that I said in the first equation, which is profits. So the real answer is what level of wages is consistent with stable prices depends on whether corporations share their profits with workers or insist on continuing to post record profit margins. Because the real answer is we have a lot of room for wages to grow without prices rising at all if corporate profit margins come down. And this has been a long-term issue in this country. We have been facing multiple decades where wages have not kept pace with productivity growth. And so the idea that we should be carefully watching to make sure that wage growth stays low in order to keep prices stable is based on a real misreading of what needs to happen in the economy to restore labor's share of income to an amount that is commensurate with the productivity that labor has created over the past 4 decades. I'll also add that, wages are another place where Chairman Powell specifically called out the dramatic increase in labor supply as one of the causes of disinflation over the last year, but then wrings his hands over growing wages without making the connection that growing wages are one of the things driving people into the labor market. And so, again, if you tell a story that blames workers for inflation and sees bigger paychecks as a problem, you are always going to have a policy prescription that allows corporate profiteering during bouts of inflation and then never allows workers to catch up. And that's a real mistake from both an equity perspective and an economic growth perspective.
Thanks, Kitty. We have a question in the chat from Rich Miller from Bloomberg. Jennifer, this is for you. You alluded to steps the executive branch could take to protect and nurture the investments in the green economy. Can you expand a bit on that? Jennifer?
Sorry.
No problem.
Small laptop muting option problem. Sure, Rich, thanks for the question. So I think the place to start here is LPO's balance sheet as one among probably several creative options that potentially exist. I think you've already seen DOE can create dual rates for offshore wind. And I think I'd like to see that basic principle applied, across a lot of these investments. A lot of the GGRF dollars, as one example, a different authority there with EPA are pretty flexible. I think some of those dollars could potentially be put to shaving down the financing costs that have gotten so much steeper over the last 12 months, in addition to kind of creative deployments of LPO's balance sheet. And again, I would put those kind of behind second in line to things that the Fed should be thinking about, not because we're asking them to become climate advocates, to be very clear. I think that there is a strong rationale inside the Fed's dual mandate around developing more fixes, more enduring fixes to inflation that would compel new Fed facilities specific to some of these infrastructure and clean energy investments.
Thanks, Jennifer. Skanda, I'm going to close it out with a question for you, diving a little bit more into recent economic data. So what does recent economic data tell us about the impact of rate hikes on inflation? And this person asks, if there was one data point the Fed could pay more attention to as they determine the path to long-term rate normalization or stabilization, what would it be? And I'll close it out with you.
Thank you. I think the notion that rate hikes are the cause of this inflation is highly dubious. I couldn't imagine a more total victory for those who have been skeptical of the Fed's narrative than seeing so much disinflation in 2023 coincide with not just the unemployment rate staying low, not just employment levels staying high, but also that real GDP would accelerate, run strongly above trend in 2023. This is something that is just not predicted by the Fed's models, by those who are saying that inflation was this persistent, demand-driven phenomenon that would only be eliminated through a much weaker labor market. So the mechanisms just seem to be totally at odds with how most people think about how Fed policy is ultimately supposed to, in fact, impact inflation, which is supposed to be through consumption, right? Right now, what I can point to in terms of the Fed's impact, the Fed has had a profound impact on the economy, but we see it obviously to some degree in asset prices. You obviously see it in the financial system. You also see it in terms of its impact on investment itself. Housing, we've talked about some of the areas in the energy industry, energy transition related investments. And you've obviously seen it even in some pockets of manufacturing where the rate hikes have had an effect. But all of this has to do with the supply side actually being weakened. The actual rubber hitting the road between Fed hikes, consumption, and inflation, there's just not a lot to point to. Thankfully, the supply side of the economy has pulled us through to much lower rates of inflation this year than last. That happened before the Fed's hikes could really have such a depressing impact on the economy is something we should all be thankful for, all feel very fortunate about. I'm hoping, and we're seeing the sort of the nascent signs of a Fed that is trying to capitalize on this fortune. I hope so, at least. We've been somewhat lucky to be able to get through a period of high interest rates and still keep plowing ahead. I think keeping interest rates here for much longer comes with a lot more risk than people realize, and it's good to get preemptive now about bringing down interest rates. How far the Fed should go, I would probably pick out, if you allow me, 2 data points here to really point to, and they're both really about the supply side of the economy, which is employment and investment, right? So employment, we want employment to continue to grow. We want to see the wage gains of recent years, which started out as mostly nominal wage gains, but are increasingly translating into real wage gains. We want to see that actually attract more people into high wage, high productivity jobs and develop a new kind of job growth relative to the kind that we saw in the previous decade, which I would describe as largely low wage, highly precarious, and generally slightly lower productivity in general because of that. So in some ways, wages are going to be kind of a key intermediary for boosting the supply side, and that means attracting people into sort of the high value add, knowledge intensive, capital adjacent sectors of the economy that really could benefit from more investment. We want to see employment grow there. We also just want to see more investment, and more investment that's unlocked as we may see a path of interest rate normalization next year, would be very welcome. And the more we see it, and the less we see that it's actually stoking inflation, the way the Fed conventionally thinks about it, in terms of lower interest rates means higher inflation risk, we may actually find that it actually just does more to add to investment. And if that's the case, the Fed could probably stand to probe a little lower, where normal is. Chair Powell said it himself that it's very uncertain. We don't know exactly what counts as neutral for where the Fed funds rate should ultimately end up if inflation really does come down to 2%. But the Fed should be exploring that, and that requires being highly attentive to how their policies really do interact with the supply side. This is a different economy than even the one we had in 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So it's just going to be really important for them to adapt. And I'd say to focus on employment and investment here, because both are potentially affected by the Fed's policies. Keeping employment on strong footing helps to promote more productive outcomes over time, and also make sure we stay away from recessions, which are both bad for people, for families, and also bad for the productive capacity of the economy. And on investment, because it turns out like a lot of what the Fed's doing, they might think they're helping on inflation, but they're also inflicting a lot of long-term costs potentially, and long-term price instability. I think about a very tangible example here is one that Kitty referred to, which is that home builders, especially those who are building rentals, those builders have largely pulled back in a pretty meaningful sense. And we know there's a structural housing shortage. We know that this is an area where it's been one of the most challenging areas for families and households to be able to keep up with rising rents. We're going to need to build more over time. But if we're keeping interest rates very high for a punitively long period of time, we're ultimately going to have a rental supply shortage that becomes more acute in future years, all because of Fed policies that were intended to curb inflation today, but may ultimately spawn more inflation in a couple of years. So it's just really important for the Fed to pay attention to all the different forms of investment that are really critical for shaping our long-term future in terms of maximum employment and price stability, and to take an appropriately flexible view there.
This is Kitty. I'd love to just jump in and be a little extra nerdy, if that is even possible. And, what do we mean when we're talking about a long time or a short time, a fast path? What do we mean by normalizing interest rates? So if you look at the economic projections that the Fed put out today and the dot plots, what you see is that the consensus view among the governors seems to be that the long-term appropriate interest rate level is around 2.5%. And Skanda or Jen should really jump in if I'm out over my skis. But that is much lower than where we are now. And the Fed's interest rate hiking campaign was extraordinarily rapid. And if you believe that that was the wrong medicine, and that did not, in fact, cause the disinflation we've seen, but may have just created unnecessary instability, we need to really be thinking about a fairly rapid return to what the Fed believes is the appropriate long-term policy rate. And so I was quite surprised to see that there don't seem to be any Fed governors who think that we should normalize rates next year. And that needs to be the question that we're asking, is really, how quickly should we be returning to normal interest rate levels, rather than thinking about a wait and see approach? If we don't actually think that it was the right medicine, then it does not make sense to take a cautious approach to moving back to normal rates. There are actually really, really big risks associated with maintaining a level that we have not seen all of the negative effects of yet. We heard a lot early in the rate hiking campaign about long and variable lags in the effectiveness of monetary policy. We're not hearing that anymore as the Fed takes credit for extremely rapid disinflation. But if you believe that there are long and variable lagged effects of interest rate hikes, which I think, Skanda has described some of the ways that that can play out, then we need to really worry about the continued lagged effects, given that growth in CPI has, as Jen pointed out, been basically flat over the last couple of months.
If I could also just tack on there's a growing risk that the Fed is, given the distance between where interest rates are right now, 5.5%, and what Kitty referred to, which was where the Fed still thinks that neutral interest rate is, where they're not having any sort of supportive or a contractionary effect on the economy, which would be a 2.5. The Fed are kind of the kings of fudging in terms of using different excuses for why their policy may be able to justify things on a one-off basis. Maybe there's some hidden parameter or hidden variable that is a justification for keeping rates extra high right now, even though neutral is 2.5. I think the Fed really needs to be, I say careful. I mean, they should strongly avoid relying on these types of fudge factors, smudge factors, whatever you want to call it, where things like the neutral interest rate might have moved. I think these excuses don't fill the bigger gap between where interest rates are right now, where they have said interest rates would be if we're sort of in a neutral state. There's a lot of distance to cover. I'd say the first part of that at least should move especially quickly. As you go further, there's maybe more room for evaluation, but getting away from these significantly restrictive levels, the right time to it would be good to move expeditiously in that direction if we continue to see these particularly encouraging signs for where inflation is headed.
Thanks, Skanda. And with that, and on that note, I want to thank our wonderful economic experts, Jennifer Harris, Kitty Richards, and Skanda Amarnath. If you have any additional questions that didn't get answered here today, please email press@groundworkcollaborative.org. And thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.